the book itself is called Female Husbands, and female husband was a term that was defined in the 18th century, and I chart the changing understandings of that term throughout the book. But at its core, a female husband was someone assigned female at birth. They transgender in some way, usually as teenagers. They lived as Mostly they lived as men. Some of them lived as non-binary people. Most of them lived as men. And they entered into legal marriages with women. So it wasn't just that they dated women, but they entered into legal marriages with women. And so that's always what I'm referring to when I say female husband for 95% of the book. And it's really just at the end when I start to identify the collapse of that term, how it loses its meaning and it loses its specificity really in chapter 8, and then it stops being used. And that's around the turn of the 20th century. So the book itself it starts in 1746, it runs through half of the 18th century, all of the 19th century, and then right around World War I, you just see the category expand and lose its meaning and understanding, and then also fall out of usage. I think the key thing about the book that I'm the most excited and proud about is that it combines methods of social and cultural history. So it relies a lot on newspaper accounts, which are sometimes 95% reliable and sometimes less so, but that it also does a lot of work to kind of offer another framing of the story, because the newspaper accounts are often, really sensationalized and trying to attract readers and trying to really tease out some of the most controversial or scandalous aspects of people's lives. And so my work as a social historian is also to really try to ground them and pull out some of the more mundane facts about the lives of female husbands and their queer wives, sometimes their larger extended family, sometimes, their community. And then to chart the changing, views and understandings of both the individuals and then also the representations of the individuals over time. So I pulled out a couple of selections to read that I think are representative of some of the defining themes of the book. And the first one is, I thought I should start with Charles Hamilton from 1746. Some of you are familiar with the case because Henry Fielding wrote a fictionalized version of their life that was, popular and widely circulated. But what I'm going to read for you first is an account that appeared in the Weekly Postboy, the Boston Weekly Postboy in 1747. So it's around 6 months after the case itself was tried. And part of what that shows is the transatlantic movement of knowledge and stories about these people. So this is from an exact quote from a newspaper article. At a quarter sessions of the peace held at Taunton, Somersetshire, Mary Hamilton was tried for pretending herself a man and marrying 14 wives, the last of which, Mary Price, deposed in court that she was married to the prisoner and bedded and lived as man and wife for a quarter of a year, during which time she thought the prisoner a man, owing to the prisoner's vile and deceitful practices. After a debate of the nature of the crime and what to call it, it was agreed that she was an uncommon, notorious cheat and sentenced to be publicly whipped in Taunton, Glastonbury, Wells, and Shipton Mallet, and to be imprisoned for 6 months, and to find security for her good behavior for as long time as the justices at the next quarter session shall think fit. And so there's a reference in there to the question of sexual intimacies, which is a feature in some of the accounts, the idea that what led a woman or a female wife to think that their husband was a cisgender man was because they had sex that seemed like what they thought sex would be, or like sex they had had before. But then that's also used to discount the person when Mary changed her mind and said, no, that wasn't what I was, used to or wasn't what I was expecting. I was just deceived. And the other thing that you see there is the authorities taking this very, very seriously. So this is a very serious punishment. And it's not just because Charles Hamilton transgender. It's not just because Charles Hamilton had sex with a woman as a trans person. It's also because they entered into a legal marriage that other authorities, right, or people didn't know. So that was a tremendous threat to the social order, to the stability of the categories of man and woman, and also to the idea of heterosexual relationships being what people expect them to be. The other case that I think really solidifies the category in the 18th century is James Howe. And I actually write a whole chapter about James Howe. James Howe was remarkable in that they and their wife, Mary, chose to do this together when they were teenagers. They decided that one of them would transgender. That became James. They got legally married, and they ran a series of taverns throughout London. And I'll just read you a brief snippet here just to anchor us there. James Howe transformed himself into a man and husband at the age of 16 in 1732. Howe lived as a man for over 30 years undetected, achieving wealth and the esteem of the local community of Poplar, England, as the owner of the popular White Horse Tavern in London's East End. And the thing that sets them apart and really sets Mary apart is that we do have evidence that she knew that her husband's lived gender was different than their assigned sex when they entered into their relationship. Wives and lovers of female husbands were often portrayed as ignorant women who were duped into believing that they married men. But this was never the case for Howe's wife, Mary. Mary and James came up with the idea that they lived together as wife and husband. This was bold, unconventional, and a challenge to all laws and expectations governing women. Mary was never given her due as a radical actor in the newspaper accounts or the scholarship. She chose to forgo sexual intimacy with a cisgender man. She did not need or want children. She enjoyed the care and company of her husband, the financial stability their shared business brought, and the respect of the local community. Mary Howe was by all counts living a good life. And this, I argue, is part of why she was denied any agency and identity in the stories. Because she's never even mentioned by name. I found her actual name after 2 years of digging in the archival records. Because usually the newspapers present the wives of female husbands as ignorant and duped. And she was neither of those things. And so I think in some ways, Mary could have been a greater threat to the social order than James. Because what if other women recognized that what Mary did, right? What if they thought that she was a bold, inspiring role model, that they too could reject motherhood and pursue relationships with female husbands? And the other reason why this case is so interesting is that they're written about for 100 years. And so looking at their lives is one way that you can see the changing attitudes of the press, who later turns on female husbands. They're written about with a certain amount of, yes, curiosity and sensationalism, but also respect and intrigue, especially from the middle of the 18th century until the middle of the 19th century. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that transition in a minute. The book itself is mostly about husbands, and so I want to take some of this time to draw out a little bit more about the experience of queer wives. Because as queer wives to female husbands, their relationships were, in some ways, they could have been very similar, right, to other relationships. But they had a different kind of social power and also a different kind of social vulnerability. And this is evident in two of the cases. One is Abigail Allen, who was married to James Allen for decades. And they were, as most of the female husbands and queer wives, they were white laborers, and many of them of British origin, even when we later in the book end up in the US. And so when James Allen was killed in a tragic work accident in a dockyard, Abigail came under tremendous scrutiny about her character, what she knew, what she didn't know, and she was attacked by neighbors. Her livelihood was threatened. And so you see there this incredible vulnerability that she had, to the point that she had to write a statement that was printed in the local press saying that she didn't know that her husband was assigned female at birth, that she thought that her husband was, in our terms, our terminology, a cisgender man. And so that's one example. The other example is from the same era. It's a little later. It was from Manchester, and that's the wife of Henry Stokes. And so in this case, you see Anne Stokes was married to Henry for about 20 years. It seems like he might have been abusive with a drinking problem. She managed his very lucrative business, and she had had enough. And there comes a moment when she appeals. She's trying to get a divorce on favorable terms. And so this is an example of the power that a queer wife could have, because she leverages her knowledge that by outing her husband about her husband's sex could be used to work in her favor. And she does exactly that. She runs to a lawyer. The whole story is printed in the paper. And what she does is kind of flip the script on her whole life and that of female husbands and queer wives, where historically the whole idea that they kind of lived and fight for is that sex and gender are two different things. So we're born and we're assigned to sex, and then the gender that we embrace and live might be in alignment with that sex, it might not be. And of course, husbands, it's not in alignment with that sex. It's very different. But what Anne Stokes says when she goes to the authorities is, I want a divorce. My marriage is not legitimate because my husband is really a woman. And so when it is potentially to work to her own advantage, of course, she tries to degender her husband, de-emphasize the role of gender in her husband's life and in their relationship, and use that as the basis for sympathy. And it seems to work. So most of the cases I've talked about so far are up until the mid-19th century, and all of these stories establish the main tropes for the category of female husbands and their queer wives. They're generally seen through a lens in which sex and gender are different things. They're not necessarily accepted in their community, because when people get outed, there's usually some kind of punishment, some kind of threat. People leave town. But there also can be a little bit of respect. And I know those seems like contradictory things, like how could they be respected in their manhood but not accepted or allowed to continue living their lives as they were before? I think people were really curious about the couples themselves, as well as, what did it mean that people could live in a gender that was different than their sex? And what were the implications of that for other people? The mid-19th century, both in the UK and the US, marks a variety of changes. And so the first half of the book is predominantly covers the UK. The second half addresses the US. But as I said before, there's tremendous movement between the two places, because newspaper stories are circulating back and forth. Cases that are happening in the UK are being reported in the US press, less so vice versa, but somewhat. People are moving from the UK to the US and living lives as female husbands. But what happens in the mid-19th century is a decline in the number of accounts in the UK. It sort of just loses its excitement as a descriptive category. An increase in the US. The US is always behind following you. We know that. The US press is marked by a heightened use of derogatory language, and that takes a number of different forms, mostly around not respecting the manhood of the husbands and referring to them as women husbands, or people who are really women, like really emphasizing the womanhood of the person who transgender, whereas the earlier records are more respectful and curious about people's manhood. The other things that are happening simultaneously is, tremendous number of social movements, the abolition of slavery, women's rights, and female husbands get caught up in the women's rights movement in ways that they probably didn't know about and didn't want, but they're increasingly written about in relationship to the women's rights movement, both to delegitimize the women's rights movement, which is the women's rights movement is really about women who want the rights that men have. They want to become more like men. And also, then female husbands actually become more of a threat. Like when men and women have more of the same rights and more equal access to education and political authority and economic autonomy, then there becomes this conversation that, well, why would any woman marry a cisgender man if they could marry a female husband? And so all of this is, circulating in the late 19th century at the same time. This also coincides with a thread that runs through this book, is about policing in the carceral state, and the kind of punishment that is meted out at people for transing gender. It's very uneven. It's very unpredictable. It can vary widely from place to place. In most of the accounts, you see a panic, really. Someone who discovers that someone's gender is different than their sex, they often run to the authorities, the police, the magistrate. That person usually doesn't know what to do. There's very seldom a law on the books against transing gender or cross-dressing. That changes in the 1850s and 60s, especially in the US with the formalization of laws against cross-dressing. So a lot happens in this era to kind of, criminalize transing gender, criminalize cross-dressing, criminalization of the poor also. And then we see the rise in sexology. And so for people who are historians of sexuality, we're so familiar with this era of 1880 to 1920 as being a really formative moment in, creating and solidifying our contemporary categories of homosexuality. And we know that researchers and doctors at that time were trying to work out, well, how do you define and know that someone's homosexual? And one of the earliest kind of working definitions was a correlation between same-sex desire and gender nonconformity. So for most of the 20th century, and this is one of the ways that I got into this project, female masculinity is conflated with homosexuality, right? So in all this scholarship, who is the true homosexual? There are effeminate men and there are masculine women. And so part of what Female Husbands does is in some way try to flip that upside down and say that crucial turning point in the history of sexuality made sexuality and sexual desire the overdetermined feature, and gender as kind of underneath that as less important. And that is like what has defined, modern gay life because of that moment. And what Female Husbands allows us to see is just how big and important the conversation around gender nonconformity was. And you can track this moment when it got sublimated underneath sexual desire, sexual deviance, sexual inversion. And so I actually have, just really two more passages, and one speaks to that moment. And it's also coincides with the case of, the person that I call the last UK female husband, because they kind of briefly resurge and they make their way into the back of my book. John Coulter is the last the last British female husband, and in many ways, Coulter lived a life a lot like James Allen. And the coverage of them, even though it was in 1870, it could have been easily in 1820 or 1830. So it really reflected this older British tradition that the US accounts and the telling of them had already abandoned. But I bring this up because Havelock Ellis mentions John Coulter in a footnote. in a passage about Joseph Lobdell. And so if you're, interested in this period at the end of the 19th and early 20th century and how my book speaks to and relates to sexology, this is one of the moments that I find just fascinating. And so I'm going to read you a paragraph about the sexologist and John Coulter. Sexologists use these accounts to illuminate their new theories about homosexuality. In Volume 1 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, for instance, Havelock Ellis mentioned John Coulter, the last UK husband, in a footnote that was principally a case about Joseph Lobdell. This chapter concerned, quote, sexual inversion in women and grappled with the relationship between gender nonconformity and same-sex desire. The chief characteristic of the sexually inverted woman is a certain degree of masculinity. As I have already pointed out, a woman who is inclined to adopt the ways and garments of men is by no means necessarily inverted, end quote. Ellis notes people drawn to men's clothing, but who were not known to be involved sexually with women, such as Mary Frith and Sir James Barry. But sexual inverts are driven to wear men's clothing, and the reasoning given by Ellis is important. Quote, in such cases, male garments are not usually regarded as desirable chiefly to account of practical convenience, nor even in order to make an impression on other women, but because the wearer feels more at home in them. And Ellis placed both Joseph Lobdell and John Coulter in this category. And so I, really find that passage so instructive because his analysis and understanding of them does reflect, some of my findings from female husbands. And it spoke to this earlier time where people were, really still invested in, separating out gender from sexuality, and that there was value, that if you really wanted to try to understand people, that you wouldn't conflate those two things together. And they did get conflated in turn of the century sexology, and really later in the century, of course, into the 20th century is where we see so many people, doctors, trans people, trying to disaggregate them again, right? And get people to think and understand gender and sex as different things. I think the last thing I'll say, and then I'm happy to open up to questions, is another contribution that the book makes is that it's trying to understand trans lives and trans experiences before transsexuality was possible, before the medical technology and even language was available for people to physically, medically change their sex. So to have gender affirming medical care through hormones, through other kinds of procedures. And so what was it like, right, to be a gender nonconforming trans person with those kinds of desires and feelings before you were able to access medical care? And I think one of the things, the takeaways is, that people did it, and maybe lots of people did it. I don't know. I mean, we only get to find out about the people who were in some ways kind of outed and caught and written about. And it's really just too bad that a lot of people, because of safety and because of, social judgment, weren't able at this time to write more publicly about their lives and their feelings. And if they did write about them, in diaries, as we know is so often the case, other family members would have destroyed them. They're not running down to the local historical society. And even if they did, the person at the local historical society at the time probably would have thought it was shameful and embarrassing, and not really collected it and cataloged it and encouraged researchers to use it. So there's so many things that we know from the history of sexuality and LGBTQ histories that really present tremendous barriers to us ever knowing the full truth about people's lives. And that absolutely holds true for female husbands. that's, what we're left with newspaper accounts. And the newspaper records are hard. People definitely ask me, how do you know what's true? How do you know what you can trust? Isn't it hard reading so many accounts that misgender people, and that sometimes are mean? And it absolutely is. Some of them are cruel, and I think I keep doing it and keep reading it for several reasons. One is that some of them are kind, and I think that surprised me in the beginning, especially. Some of them are kind and respectful and curious, about trans people. So there is a more complicated past. It's not just simply, that it was all bad then. And the other thing is, I think, we have to know these stories. We have to grapple with this history, even if it's uncomfortable and even if it's not on our own terms. It doesn't do us any good to not have a past, and to avoid reading these records, because they're painful. We know that the idea that, transgender is a new fad and that there's this movement pressuring people to transgender, that so much of why that movement gains legitimacy is by saying, look, it's new. These people just made this up 20 years ago. And we know that's not true. That's not true at all. And we know that people have transgender throughout history for any number of reasons, and that it's so important that we have record of this, and also people that were able to live happy, rich, complicated lives as trans people 200, 300 years ago, is tremendously important, for young people and for older people, middle age. I don't know where I am. And so it's worth it. It's worth reading against. And again, even the account that I read in the beginning, I've never read that passage out loud in a reading before. But in my view, it actually completely misgenders Charles Hamilton. And so, because it calls them, by a woman's name and using, female pronouns. And, when I write about this in my voice, I always, respectfully gender the people and use gender neutral pronouns. And so there is also that tension throughout the book. But I do think that's a productive tension for us, especially because such a big part of the transgender rights movement right now and reclaiming trans histories is just honoring, acknowledging the importance, of language that is respectful and affirming, while also, using, and not feeling like we also need to deny or erase, the historical records, that are important, that allow us to get at this truth. So that's enough for me. I'm actually going to go down to the chat box right now and see what questions you have. So what has the response been to using non-binary language in the book? I think the response has been overwhelmingly favorable, and I'm so happy about that. It was the biggest, most controversial decision that I made. And as Cecilia knows, I made it early on. Like as soon as we were meeting, I said, listen, this book has to be published with gender neutral language. The editors can't change it. Like I can't, have to argue this over every page, over every account, why that's so important. And that had been the case for everything I was publishing in this area and a lot of other people. And, Cecilia got it right away and said, no, I see it. You're right. Let's do it. And the editors at Cambridge, were absolutely, supportive as well along the way. And I think two things. One is that the non-binary language has made space for trans and non-binary people, especially young people who I've heard from, to see themselves in the past. And number one, that's it, victory. That makes me so happy. You deserve it. Number two, I think for, gender studies scholars and historians, it opened up a space to think critically about a whole bunch of transgender nonconforming people in a broader way, such as some of the soldiers and sailors and the husbands, that is capacious and exciting, without then maybe going to the next step, which some people would be uncomfortable with, and that would be saying, ascribing a transgender identity. That person is transgender. I know that person would be transgender, when we really don't know that. They lived a life that looks a lot like, the kind of lives that trans people live today. And if they did have our terminology, they certainly might not have owned that for themselves, but they also might not, right? And some people certainly might have pursued transing gender and living as men just as a vehicle, to have more rights, to have more mobility, to enter into sexual relationships with women, and they might still have felt themselves to be women. And so there's space for both of those readings. And I think in the end, what they allows is we can step back and say, actually understanding that specific motivation isn't the only interesting question, and it might not even be an important question at all, when we can look at all of these other things, and grapple with how they lived their lives, how they felt, what they said, how other people reacted to them. That we get so focused on, well, why did they do this? Were they transgender? Were they lesbians? And I think the answer to me is it doesn't matter. It's how did they live this rich, complicated life? And isn't that amazing? Were there surprises for you when you were researching? In many ways, this whole thing was a surprise. I think I have worked with newspapers before on my last project and just as a historian for a couple decades now, and I knew there were lots of little anecdotal accounts, in newspapers about gender, and people transing gender and challenging gender, and so I knew that kind of stuff was there. I knew those records were there. I didn't really know the extent to which female husbands were a thing, and that was a category that people knew about, and that once you start tracking these newspapers and these cases and the reprinting, of one story, that might get reprinted 100 times in the UK and another 100 times in the US, and you just think, wow, so everyone who was reading newspapers in 1829 would have known about James Allen's life. Like, that's remarkable. Like, that's just a level of awareness and popularity that we think of as, being reserved for maybe Christine Jorgensen, in the 1950s. And I think one of the other biggest surprises is I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania, and there was a newspaper there. It was called the Miners Journal, and it had just gotten started. Like, it wasn't around for long, but it was already reprinting these little, 1 or 2 paragraph long stories of female husband cases from London and from Manchester. And so when I think about, wow, somebody sitting around in my little small town in Pennsylvania, in 1838 would open up the newspaper and read about this case from Manchester, England, and a female husband. So there's just this trans queer experience that was like actually pervasive in mainstream popular culture throughout this whole time. But most of us have been denied knowledge of that and denied access to that, because of the way history books are written and the way we're taught it in school, and what gets identified as important or legitimate or not. Um, okay, I just got another question over here. Have I noticed different reactions to the book from people of different ages? That's a great question. I don't know that I have enough information to answer that. I will say that as I was trying to make some of the decisions around methodology in the early years, I was very torn between writing a book that was true to some of the methods and expectations for the field of the history of sexuality among professional historians, and writing a book that would speak to trans people and the language that we use now to describe ourselves and to understand the world around us. And I definitely got some feedback from people who I admire and whose work I respect and who I still adore, but that basically said, you cannot write a book using they. It's confusing, it's hard to read, your peers won't take it seriously, and it will quickly become dated as if it's a fad of this moment. And I'm glad that person was, honest enough in giving me their professional opinion to say that. And I definitely lost sleep for probably a couple weeks. And I wasn't sure 100% that I was making the right decision, but I will say I knew this. If I was forced to make a decision between speaking to one group versus another, and in that moment I felt that I had to choose young trans people or young people or any trans people. I had to choose the community who most deserve this book and to whom it might mean the most, which might sound ridiculous, but in terms of the idea that anybody needs my book to live their trans life. But I just felt like there's already so much scholarship on other people who are gender nonconforming throughout history, or strong women, female soldiers, female sailors, and they've always been, upheld as feminist icons for the women's movement, sometimes associated as pioneering lesbians, and those people had already been claimed and celebrated using and historians of sexuality and women's historians were very comfortable with those narratives. And I felt like there was another group that wasn't having a different version of that story told, a different reading of that archive, and that could be just as true as any other one. And so I definitely made those decisions to speak to my students, to speak to young people, to speak to trans people who deserve history. Okay, so what do I wish today's queer and trans communities would learn from histories of gender nonconforming people that I write about? Well, definitely, you're not alone. You're not the first person, to do this or to struggle with these things. You're actually part of a larger history that people have resisted and rejected and resented the gender norms that their society has placed on them, and tried to require them to live their lives within. And so there's actually a wonderful legacy of people resisting that and saying, no, I'm different and I need to move through this world differently. And so that's so important. I think, I don't know if this is like a lesson or not, but one of the things that the book just forces us to accept because of the limitation of available records is we really don't know how people thought or felt about themselves. We don't get the language of someone's own gender identity. All we get are their gender expression and how other people in the world around them made sense of that. And I think that's interesting because what does it look like? How does our movement for trans rights and access right now around identification, around healthcare, around classroom spaces, around employment, does that look any different if we shift our emphasis away from articulating and wanting people to understand our individual gender identities versus saying, let's just make space and respect and rights and access for everyone who has a non-conforming gender expression or a transgender expression, and that they don't have to make the case or claim what it means to them, right? And so that the idea of having to make the case about having some true inner sex that is different than what people see in order to be a legitimate transgender person and get access to care, that was put on us by doctors in the mid 20th century. That was all made up, and that's a source of gatekeeping in the present. And so I wonder, what would our movement and priorities and how we, relate to ourselves and each other, how might that be different if we, rejected that narrative about an interior gender identity that makes sense in the way that doctors check off the boxes and just insisted on, gender liberation, gender expansive possibilities for everyone. And what's one historical resource to wish you had access to? I guess anybody's diary, right? So any female husband or queer wife's diary this completely contradicts what I just said. So about them, their sense of their own gender, their sense of love and intimacy, the sense of their relationship. We just we just don't have that. And the records that we do have, of course, the voices that we do have from some people, they're so mediated. So by the time something ends up being reported in the newspaper about a couple, well, they're often, one of them was arrested, and they're often like accounts from people under incredible duress. So the husband and the wife are in the police station and being interrogated. And so we know there's an incredible amount of like strategic lying and truth telling in those moments in order to protect your life and your safety. And so when we get the voices of people through the newspapers, the circumstances in which they're made available to us are highly fraught. So I guess just a less mediated reflection on their gender, sexuality, love relationship for anybody. Okay, let me see. I'm fascinated by the idea that a trans person in the 19th century could get married, practically speaking, because wouldn't their assigned sex be known in the community? For example, you gave they transitioned. Oh, sorry. I need to read. Because wouldn't their assigned sex be known in the community? The example you gave was that they transitioned in their teens. Right. So a key part that I apparently neglected to say is that most people had to leave home to transgender. And this speaks to the class background of most of the female husbands, were poor laboring people. In the case of James and Mary Howe, they came from very poor families who put them out to service in their youth. So they were already on their own. And that's very consistent. A lot of the other cases, people were poor, or they were orphaned, or they were running away. And so in order for people to transgender, they're leaving home, they're leaving family, for better and for worse, right? And so, for some people, that's a hardship and a burden that they didn't want, but they wouldn't have had a choice. And for other people, they're on the road anyway, and they have to get out and rebuild a life and take care of themselves. So, and yes, most of them are doing all of this as teenagers. But of course, remember, in the 18th and 19th century, childhood is not what it is today. So they were, even a 15 or a 16-year-old back then was already much more likely to have a job and, be moving towards adulthood. The marriage question, the legal marriage question, is so important. And I think, it also relates to the earlier question about what most surprised me. The people were able to enter into legal marriages, and it's because this is an era before documentation, before people are likely to have, birth certificates or an ID that designates your sex or gender or town. And so you see how this era, it was easier to change your gender because there wasn't a whole robust system of documentation and identifying paperwork that you carried around with you. So the rise of identification and birth certificates and passports and all that stuff creates a new barrier then for people who want to transgender and change their sex that just didn't simply exist. The other thing is, in the 19th century, if gender roles were quite distinct and rigid and clothing styles, etc., people would need a lot of reasons to question that you were not the gender that you presented yourself as, that didn't reflect your sex. You would have to give them some reason to suspect otherwise, because it was in some way unthinkable. And so one of the things that's so fun to read in the book is the descriptions when people grapple with, well, did I know that did I think that they were, did I ever question that they were not a man? And they, it kind of varies from case to case and person to person. I think Henry Stokes, for example, is one of the cases where people are saying nobody ever had any reason to question or doubt that their sex, was also male, to go along with their gender as male. And so that becomes a point of conversation. Can I say more about how the criminalization of the poor, which you mentioned briefly, shaped the category of female husbands, or your research? For example, did this criminalization increase newspaper reports or shape how people publicly talked about cross-dressing and transing? That's a great question. So I think one of the lenses that's important here is, why is this British laboring tradition and the kind of robust culture and respect that exists around that. And that is my understanding of why the female husband accounts in the UK in the first half of the 19th century are so respectful. They're about hard work. They're about, making do with the life that you've been given. In the later accounts, and this is where it becomes a US story, it's the criminalization of poverty, I think, plays a tremendous role in the denigration of female husbands. It's already been remarked, these are laboring, working people. This is not the queer trans life of the middle class. Those are other categories. And so I do think the increased policing of poverty in the US that comes from the end of slavery, from increases in immigration and the growth of cities, does play a significant role in how female husbands are viewed and treated. And that comes to life most vividly in the story of Joseph Lobdell, which is near the end of the book, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. And how people talked about cross-dressing and transing. Yes, absolutely. I think all this comes, kind of crashing down at the end of the 19th century, along with the criminalization of cross-dressing. So, most towns and municipalities start rolling out or embracing formal laws against cross-dressing from the 1860s to the 1920s. And so it's the formalization of, making transing gender illegal, the broader, hatred and denigration of poor people, and the fact that this becomes a US story that's situated in those broader trends and no longer a UK story, all shape that phenomenon. Is there any idea about occurrences of male wives? I've seen that reference, twice, I think, in thousands of articles. And I don't even remember the particulars of it. So I just want to say no, at least in the region and the period that I work on, as a phrase. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are assigned male, who transgender and lived as women. There absolutely are. And, I think Peter Boag in his book highlights some of those cases for this earlier period. And there's, wonderful other accounts of trans women, and hopefully more, because there actually are, rich archival references in the 19th century to people who, we would identify as trans women in our current terminology. So the records are there, and there's definitely more work to be done. They're just not kind of described by this, male wife as an analogous category. And I think there are reasons for that, but female husband emerges from a particular moment in the 18th century when there's just an abundance of pamphlets and novels written about different occupations and social roles that were historically reserved for men that then are being taken up by women or being imagined to be taken up by women. So we get this genre that comes up on female soldier, female sailor, female wife, female politician, that's like a literary device that exists that takes off. So just because there aren't male wives in the same way as a literary device doesn't mean that there weren't trans women or people living the lives of trans women all throughout this period. There's much work to be done on them. I think we're coming to a close, so why don't I take this opportunity just to read the closing passage of the book from the end of the conclusion. I hope that I have been true to the lives and legacies of female husbands and their queer wives in this telling. Their stories offer us a fresh perspective on the past. This radical and long-standing tradition of resistance to gender norms was well documented. These accounts, like our lives, are marked not only by resilience, love, and joy, but also vulnerability, loneliness, and conflict. This piece of LGBTQ history has been written, and it cannot be erased. It is true, and it belongs to us. Thank you for joining us.